Hello, my dear friends. After centuries of control, love today is free to the will of each individual. But in the Middle Ages, falling in love could get you punished, exiled, or even killed. Tonight, I will tell you a story from the time when love was considered a mental disorder, and engagements were seen as political contracts. Unlike what Hollywood has made it out to be, even couples who loved each other too much could be punished. If you feel this video is missing something, please leave a comment so I can put you in a deeper sleep before I continue. If this kind of quiet story is your thing, feel free to follow the channel, and if you want, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always like knowing who's here, sharing this piece of the night. There was a time when love was not called a gift. It was called a sickness. Not a sickness of the body, like fever or cough, but a sickness of the mind, of the spirit, and of the will. In the Middle Ages, falling deeply in love was not considered sweet or brave. It was something strange, something dangerous. People did not speak of it as a gentle thing. They spoke of it in whispers, as if it were an infection that could pass from one soul to another just by looking too long or longing too much. Doctors of the time, many of the monks or scholars trained in both healing and scripture, had a word for it. They called it a machios. It meant lovesickness, and they believed it was real. A person struck by a machios might be restless, unable to sleep. Their appetite could vanish. They might sit for hours in silence, staring out a window, or forget to finish a sentence because their thoughts had wandered to someone's voice or someone's face. They could become pale or flushed, hot or cold, tired yet unable to lie down. And all of this, the scholars said, came not from the heart, but from an imbalance inside the body. You see, medieval medicine was built on the idea of humours. There were 4 of them: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each one is linked to certain qualities, certain moods, and certain parts of the body. Love, they believed, was caused by an excess of warm, wet blood. And when that blood rose too high in the system, the mind lost its balance. The person stopped thinking clearly. They stopped listening to reason. They began to act on impulse, on feeling, on things that could not be explained or measured. So love was not something to be celebrated. It was something to be treated. And the treatments were often harsh, even if they were meant with care. Bloodletting was one. The healer might make a small cut near the wrist and let the blood flow until the body felt lighter, until the skin turned pale, until the fire behind the eyes had dimmed. Or they might prescribe cold baths, very cold, to shock the body back into balance, to cool the heat of desire. Some were told to fast for days, others were sent on pilgrimages, to walk away their longing 1 mile at a time, beneath rain or sun or snow. In some rare cases, if the love seemed truly unnatural, if the person had visions or heard voices or could not be calmed, the cure went further. Some were exorcised, holy words spoken above their heads. Holy water was poured at their feet, not because they had done something evil, but because people believed they had been touched by something not of this world, and in that time, anything not of this world was feared. Even inside marriage, love was not always safe. The church taught that love between husband and wife should be quiet, restrained, and proper. The purpose of that bond, they said, was to create children, not to delight in one another's presence. If a husband kissed his wife too often, or wrote her a poem, or praised her beauty too openly, it might be called lust. If a wife leaned too close or laughed too brightly, it could be seen as immodest. A priest might hear of it in confession, a neighbour might mention it in passing. And though no law was broken, the couple would feel the weight of the watching eyes, the silence of disapproval. In some villages, couples were warned not to hold hands in public. In others, too many children born too close together raised suspicion. Were they obeying the holy days of abstinence, Were they using marriage as a shelter for sin? People did not always ask these questions aloud, but they did watch, they noticed, and they remembered. There were even rules about when it was allowed to be close. During Lent, on feast days, or after attending Mass, intimacy was forbidden. If a couple were caught breaking those unspoken rules, they might be fined. They might be asked to stand in front of the church and confess, and they might be forbidden from taking communion until they had proven their repentance. This was not about punishment alone. It was about order, about discipline, about reminding people that even inside the most private spaces, someone greater was always watching. Love, then, was not what many imagine it to be. It was not sudden, sweeping, and joyful. It was quiet, cautious, and surrounded by rules. People did fall in love. Of course they did. But they were afraid of it. They feared what it could do to their minds, their bodies, their reputations, and so they hid it. They kept it folded in letters never sent, in glances quickly turned away, in poems written and burned. Even those who were married sometimes feared what they felt, because the more they loved, the more they risked losing. A good spouse could become an idol. And an idol, in the eyes of the church, was a sin. So they tried to love modestly, gently, without drawing attention, without giving names to the feelings that stirred inside them at night. Not everyone believed love was a disease, of course. Some poets wrote of it as a flame, a gift, a blessing. But those poems were whispered, shared in secret, copied by hand and passed from one friend to another like contraband. And for every verse that praised desire, there was a sermon that warned against it. For every letter sealed with wax, there was a confession spoken through tears. The truth is, love did not stop existing just because people called it an illness. It still bloomed. It still hurt. It still reached for someone in the dark. But it walked softly. It hid its face. And it learned to survive inside silence. And now, as we look back on those times, it becomes a little clearer. Why some hearts seem so quiet? Why did some lives stay so small? They were not cold. They were cautious. They were waiting for the world to grow gentler. So tonight, if your heart has ever ached, or your chest has ever tightened at the thought of someone far away, know this. You're not sick. You're simply human. And if you feel deeply, let it be a reminder that you live in a softer time. In the world of the Middle Ages, love was not a quiet, harmless thing. It was not something one could explore freely, test gently, or carry lightly in secret. Love, if it was not tied to marriage, became a matter of sin. Not private sin, hidden between two hearts, but public sin. The kind that echoed through village streets, passed between mouths at the market, and found its way to the ears of priests and magistrates alike. There was no such thing as casual affection, no such thing as learning what it means to care for someone slowly over time, before making a promise. To love someone without a wedding was to violate not just the customs of the land, but the order of heaven. The church taught that God had created marriage as the only proper vessel for desire. Everything else was deviation. Everything else was dangerous. If two people were found together, alone in a way that suggested closeness, questions would arise quickly. Were they betrothed? Was there a contract? Had the banns been read? If not, then every whisper, every touch, every stolen moment could become a reason for punishment. The act itself did not always have to be proven. Suspicion alone was enough. For women, the consequences were sharpest. A girl who was seen too often in the company of a man not her husband could be called impure. If she were thought to have given herself before marriage, her reputation might never recover. She could be cast out by her family. She might be denied a wedding entirely, forced instead to serve in another household as penance. In some places, stones would be thrown at her door at night, a cruel message, left without words. She had stepped outside the line. Even if the woman had not broken any laws, Her name could be spoken with shame. Mothers would pull their daughters away when she walked past. Fathers would refuse to speak with her. And should she ever find a man willing to marry her after such rumours, the match would be poor, the dowry reduced, the ceremony quiet and stripped of celebration. For men, things could be different, but not always kinder. A man accused of having an affair with a woman before marriage might be dragged before the village elders. If her family demanded it, he could be forced to marry her at once, regardless of his wishes. If he refused, he might be fined, beaten, or, in some places, publicly whipped. A warning to other young men that affection was not a game, and a woman's name was not to be handled carelessly. Some villages had a practice. If a man were found sneaking from a woman's home at dawn, he would be tied by the hands and walked through the town in silence, with a rope around his waist and a sign hung from his neck. It would not say what he had done. It did not need to. The silence of the crowd and the weight of the stairs said enough. The church viewed such acts not only as sin, but as offence to the divine. Every soul was meant to walk the path of righteousness. And righteousness, they said, left no room for passion without promise. Love, if it came at all, must come after the vows, after the priest, after the blessing. There were sermons given on this subject, long ones. Priests would stand before their flock and speak of Eve and the fall, of lust and the devil, of the dangers that lay in open hearts and idle hands. The people listened quietly, heads bowed, eyes lowered, but not all of them agreed. In the stillness of night, when no one watched, feelings stirred anyway. Some lovers met in secret, not because they wished to deceive, but because their love was real, and the rules around them were too heavy. They whispered their hopes beneath trees or behind barns, never knowing if the next sunrise would bring joy or punishment, and some were caught, a dropped kerchief, a glance too long. A door left unlatched. If both families wished to save face, they might arrange a quiet wedding. No music, no feast, just two hands joined beneath stone arches, with tight mouths and silent fathers. But if no such arrangement came, the consequences would follow swiftly. There were cases of women being sent away, to another town where no one knew her name, or to a convent where she would take vows she had never dreamed of. For men, exile was less common, but shame still clung. A man who had been fined for touching what he had not claimed would carry that stain for years. He might marry, but never well. He might work, but never with full trust. Some records speak of couples who resisted, who refused to be separated. They ran, they hid, they tried to start life elsewhere. But such stories often ended in grief, hunger, illness, return. The world was not kind to those who loved outside its laws. Even so, love did not vanish. It softened its shape. It made itself small. People learned to speak with glances, to press tokens into palms in passing, to smile only when the candles were blown out. They learned to wait, to suffer quietly, to hope that, somehow, their hearts would not betray them. In every generation, there were a few who dared, who believed that affection was not a crime, but their voices were quiet, their endings uncertain, and so the rest watched, learned, and tucked their longing deep into places no one could find. The path between love and shame was narrow in those days. One wrong step, and your life could change forever, not because of cruelty, always, but because of fear. Fear of chaos, fear of scandal, fear of a world where the heart led instead of the law. So tonight, if you have ever been free to love without hiding, to feel without punishment, let that be your comfort. Remember the ones who could not, the ones who were told that love was not enough, that love, without the priest's blessing, was sin. There was a time when even the smallest gesture of love could be seen as a threat. Not a threat to safety or to life, but to order, to piety, and to the delicate threads that held together a quiet village or a watchful town. In the Middle Ages, Love was not just about hearts, it was about control, and anything that hinted at affection without permission, even a folded scrap of parchment or a ribbon tied with care, could carry weight heavier than one might ever imagine. A letter, written in secret and passed between hands too quickly, was not simply a note. It could be called temptation. It could be called sorcery. In some places, it was even called a curse. A man who poured his feelings into ink might find those feelings read not by his beloved, but by the local priest or the town scribe, and what they saw on the page could be used against him. If the letter contained strange symbols, poetic phrases, or unusual drawings, it might be said to carry dark power. Not all people could read, but many believed in the magic of words. They believed that a charm could be hidden inside a sentence, that a woman could be bewitched by a phrase too beautiful or too perfect. And so, writing a love letter was not just bold, it was dangerous. In the harshest cases, a man caught sending such letters might be brought before the elders. He could be accused of deceit, of trying to claim a woman without consent. If the matter was severe, he might be punished publicly. In some regions, the tip of his ear would be cut, a quiet scar to remind him, and everyone else, of his crime. He had tried to speak through paper what he should never have spoken aloud. As for the woman who received the letter, her burden could be just as heavy. Whether she welcomed it or not, she might be summoned to confess before the church, before her family, before a gathering of stone-faced men who would ask, again and again, what she had done with the words. Had she hidden them? Had she read them more than once? Had she written back to receive affection without asking for it, was still to carry the blame? Because in that world, silence was not innocence, it was suspicion. And in some cases, a girl could be forbidden from attending festivals or entering church until she had shown true repentance. Her home might be visited, her mother might weep in shame, her brothers might threaten the boy who had written, and through it all, the letter, something once sweet, would be kept as evidence. But it was not only words that carried danger. Objects, too, held meaning. A ribbon passed from one hand to another, a cloth square with stitched initials, a pendant on a leather cord. In today's eyes, they seemed simple, but in that time, they were signals, silent admissions. To give or receive a token was to declare something out loud without saying a word. And if a woman was seen wearing such a gift, especially if the man was not her husband or betrothed, whispers would follow. Was she claimed? Was she hiding a secret? Did she offer herself in return for something wrapped in silver or thread? In some towns, families took great care to inspect what their daughters wore. A new brooch, a colourful sash, a carved bead, all might need explanation. If the answer was unclear, suspicion grew, and suspicion, once rooted, was hard to uproot. For those who gave the gifts, there were laws. A man found offering a token without permission could be charged with misconduct. He might be forced into labour for the church. He might be fined heavily, especially if the girl's family was of higher standing. If he belonged to a trade, he might be banned from selling in the market for a season. For some, the damage to reputation was worse than the punishment itself. The girl's family, too, could suffer. Even if she had done nothing, if she had simply smiled at the wrong time or worn the wrong thread, her entire household might feel the sting. They could be uninvited to holy days, refused the sacraments, and treated coldly by neighbours. The stain of impropriety was hard to wash away. The church watched closely. It taught that true love was patient, chaste, and ordered by God through the vows of marriage. Anything else was deceit. Anything hidden was suspect. Priests gave sermons about modesty, about guarding the heart and the body alike, and people listened, because they had to. But behind all this caution, the human heart still moved. People still felt, still hoped, still yearned. And so, despite the danger, letters were still written. gifts were still passed, in hidden corners of fields, behind the stalls of a quiet market, at the edge of candlelight. Two hands might meet and exchange something small, something soft, something treasured. Sometimes those tokens led to marriage. Sometimes they led to ruin. But even in the face of risk, people kept giving, kept writing, because they needed to. Because in a world of silence, a single word, a single gesture could carry more meaning than 1,000 sermons. And when a letter was too dangerous to keep, it was burned. The ash was scattered in the wind, but the word stayed in the mind. When a gift had to be hidden, it was sewn into a sleeve, or buried in a chest, or tucked beneath straw. Love, though forbidden, always found a place to rest. Even now, when we read old records and see only mentions of punishment, we can sense what they tried to protect. A glance too long, a ribbon too bright, a name spoken softly before sleep. All small things, all dangerous, all unforgettable. So if you have ever tied meaning to a necklace, or pressed words into a message meant only for one person, know that you are part of something old, something fragile, something brave. The gift is not the object. It is the willingness to give, even when the world tells you not to. In the still air of a medieval village, even the smallest gesture could be loud. A hand reaching for another, a glance held just a moment too long, a smile exchanged in the wrong place. All of it could speak more clearly than words, and sometimes what it said was enough to disturb the calm order of the day. To show affection in public was not romantic. It was improper. It was dangerous. The church watched over the people not only from the pulpit, but from every shadow of the chapel. In many places the priest was not just a man of prayer, but the eyes and ears of the village's morality. He was expected to notice, to record, and when needed, to report. If a young couple were seen sitting too close beneath a tree, or lingering after Mass, or brushing hands at the well, their names might appear quietly in a parish ledger, not with accusation, at first, but with concern. That concern could grow quickly. Whispers were swift in places where lives were simple and routines were shared. If a boy helped a girl carry her basket across the square and their laughter carried too far, someone would remember it. If two people were seen walking too slowly past the market stalls, not saying much, but not saying anything either, someone else would notice. And in time, those moments added up. They formed a picture, one that did not need to be painted in colour to stir judgment. Affection, in the eyes of many, belonged behind closed doors and within the bonds of marriage. To display it openly was not just to break rules, but to challenge the sense of order that held the village together. If love could appear wherever it pleased, then what would come next? Questions no one wanted to ask. Changes no one wanted to welcome. So the rules were kept firm, and the watchers remained many. Punishments for public affection were meant to shame as much as they were meant to correct. A man and woman found embracing or kissing in view of others might be brought to the centre of town. There, in full sight. They could be bound together by a rope and marched in silence. Around their necks, wooden signs would hang. They did not describe the act in detail. They simply named it. Sin, indecency, pride. In some places, a collar made of iron was used, not to wound, but to display. It would lock around the neck of the offender, marking them as one who had forgotten themselves. Sometimes, the collar was chained to a wooden frame, and the person had to stand there for a day, or longer, while villagers passed by without speaking, not out of cruelty, but out of expectation. This was how shame was shown. This was how order was restored. The effects did not stop with the person punished. In a world where family name was everything, disgrace spread quickly and stayed long. A daughter who laughed too freely might cost her sister a good marriage. A son who stared too often at a girl not yet promised might cause his father to lose favour with the local lord. No action was ever entirely private. The village was a web, and every thread pulled on the next. Mothers warned their daughters early, keep your eyes low, speak softly, smile, but not too much, and if a boy speaks to you in the field, turn your back before anyone sees. Fathers taught their sons to walk quickly, to greet without touching, and to remember that no woman was ever alone in the eyes of the church. But hearts do not always listen to rules, and even under watchful eyes, people still hoped, still looked, still leaned just slightly closer than they should, and when they did, the risks were known. A family might spend years rebuilding what a single morning had damaged. A household once invited to every feast might find its name missing from the next celebration, and a girl once known for her grace might become the quiet subject of every whispered tale. Not all punishments were written into law. Many lived in silence, in lost opportunities, in cold greetings at the well. A boy who had been marched through town with a sign around his neck might never be allowed to apprentice with the tradesman he admired. A girl who had been seen lingering too long outside the church might find her dowry no longer enough. Even if no crime had been committed, the shadow lingered, and so love learned to hide. People kept their affections small, a glance only when no one was watching, a gift left not in hand, but near a doorstep, a phrase of affection said with eyes instead of lips. The heart continued its work, but it wore a cloak now. It moved with caution. It learned to speak in silence. Still, the courage it took to feel something in such a world should not be forgotten. It was not only a rebellion, it was not only a risk, it was a quiet kind of bravery. To care, even when caring might cost you everything, is no small thing. And many did it. Over and over, across centuries, in markets and meadows, in chapels and corridors. They loved anyway. So if you have ever held someone's hand without fear, or smiled at someone without watching who might be looking, know how precious that is. Many could not, who paid dearly for less, who carried the memory of a touch like it was a burden and a treasure at once. Now, as the night grows still and the wind softens at your window, remember those who walked carefully, who felt deeply, and who hoped quietly. Their footsteps echo behind us, even now, and in that quiet, you may find peace. Sleep gently, where no one watches your dreams. Sleep well, and without shame. There is more to tell when morning comes. In the quiet folds of the medieval world, where fields stretched long and roads were still of dirt and stone, some boundaries could not be crossed, not with words, not with gold, not even with love. One of the strongest was the line drawn between social classes. It was not written in ink or etched into walls, but it lived in every look, every gesture, every expectation passed down from parent to child. To love beyond your station was not just unwise. It was seen as a betrayal, a kind of treason, not against a king, but against the order that gave every person their place. A peasant who dared to admire a noble might not speak a word, but if his eyes lingered too long, or if his words carried too much warmth, trouble would come. Some stories tell of farm boys beaten for merely offering to carry a noble girl's basket. Others were dragged before the manor court, accused not of violence or theft, but of insolence. In villages ruled by lords with harsh tempers, a poor man who looked too kindly at a rich daughter might be taken aside and whipped. In darker tales, bones were broken, a leg smashed, a hand crushed, so that no work could be done again without pain. These were not random cruelties. They were messages. The class structure was to be protected. The idea that a landless man could dream of love with someone born into linen and lace was dangerous. If one exception were made, the whole pattern could unravel. It was better, they thought, to make the lesson unforgettable. Let the punishment be seen. Let the warning be clear. For servants, the risk was greater still. Living in the same household as those of higher rank meant constant proximity. A glance across a courtyard, a whispered word in a hallway, a kindness mistaken for something more. These were the seeds of suspicion, and if affection was found, or even rumoured, the response was swift and harsh. A servant caught expressing feelings for the child of their master could be stripped of their clothing and tied to a post in the market square. There, under the open sky and the watchful eyes of townsfolk, they would be lashed until the message sank in. You are not equal. You do not belong. Your heart must be taught its place. Some families took such shame personally. A master whose servant touched his daughter might see it not only as disobedience, but as defilement. That servant would not only lose their job, they would lose their name, their future, and sometimes their ability to walk away at all. And what of the women? A noble daughter who fell in love with a man beneath her rank might find herself locked in her room, windows barred, food passed through a door that never opened. She might be forbidden to speak to anyone beyond her own family, and if the whispers grew louder, if the rumours refused to die, she would be married off quickly to someone deemed suitable. To someone who would erase the scandal, the marriage would not wait for affection to grow, it would come with haste. Sometimes the suitor was old, sometimes cruel, but he was rich, and that made him correct. The girl might cry, but her tears would not be mentioned. Her mother would tell her to be silent. Her father would refuse to look at her as the vows were spoken. Even among common folk, class differences mattered. A girl from a family that owned their land might be told she was too good for a boy who rented his. A craftsman's daughter might be forbidden from seeing an apprentice. Love, they said, was not enough. Bread must be earned. Standing must be kept. The heart could be ignored. And yet, love did happen. Quietly, riskily. A farm boy might leave a carved trinket near a noble stable. A housemaid might slip a folded note into the pocket of a fine coat she washed. A wealthy girl might pass a boy on the road and offer him a flower, pretending it meant nothing. But every one of those small acts carried weight. If discovered, they could destroy more than their reputation. They could change lives. Some did run. A noble girl and her poor lover flee into the woods, hoping to find refuge in another village, a maid and a stable hand, disappearing after midnight, never to be seen again. But most did not. Most loved in silence, loved in fear, loved with eyes that could not speak and hands that never touched. Those who dared to cross the line often paid dearly, and those who watched learned to stay within it. It was not just a matter of safety, it was survival. Better to be lonely than to be broken. Better to obey than to be cast out. But deep beneath the rules, the longing remained. Stories were told, in low voices by the fire, of those who defied the world and loved anyway. Sometimes those stories ended in tragedy, but sometimes they ended in peace, in a small cottage far from the town, where no one asked questions. In a life built slowly, quietly, and together. These tales were passed on, not in books, but in memory, because even when the world forbade it, the heart still dreamed of someone just out of reach. And in dreaming, it remembered that every human, noble or not, was made of the same warmth and breath. So tonight, as you lie in stillness, think of the ones who dared to love across the lines, who whispered when they were told to shout, who hoped when hope was called foolish. Let their courage wrap around you like a soft cloak, and sleep gently, with no walls between you and the dreams that wait. Sleep well, and sleep warm. More stories are coming when the night deepens again. In the quiet world of the Middle Ages, where order held more weight than mercy and appearances mattered more than questions, few things stirred fear and fury like adultery. To break the sacred bond of marriage was not just a personal failure. It was a sin that rippled outward, touching family, faith, and the very soul of a village. It was seen as an offence not only against a spouse but against society. And more than that, against God. Marriage, in that time, was more than a private promise. It was a spiritual duty, a legal contract, a social anchor. To stray from it, even in silence or secrecy, was to tear at a thread too delicate to repair. And when that thread broke, punishment was not delayed. It was public. It was brutal. And it was meant to be remembered. If a woman was caught in adultery, or even accused with some measure of belief, she faced more than words. In many villages, her punishment began with exposure, not of the sin alone, but of her dignity. Her clothes might be stripped away, leaving her wrapped in shame and silence. A tall, heavy hat, shaped like horns, was placed on her head, a mockery of the one she betrayed, a sign to all that she had brought ruin to her home. She would be tied to a wooden post, not in private, but in the village square, where children ran and elders walked. There she would stand, while others passed by, some staring, some pretending not to. Stones were not always thrown. Sometimes it was just glances, cold, long, without kindness. In some towns, people spat near her feet, not to strike her, but to show disgust. And in the eyes of those watching, the act of shame became a performance, not for justice, but for order, for the man. The price could be just as cruel if he was caught in the act, especially with another man's wife. Violence often followed. There are stories, quiet but firm, of men dragged from straw beds or narrow alleys and beaten without mercy. Some were taken to barns or tree stumps, where punishments were carried out behind closed doors. In the worst cases, they were mutilated. The parts of them thought to have sinned were cut, broken, or burned. Others were whipped in public, stripped to the waist, their skin marked by every lash, not to correct, but to warn. Sometimes, if the man was of higher status or the woman was unmarried, the punishment was quieter, a fine, a silent exile. A priest's scolding was spoken softly, but for those with no name to protect them, or no coin to pay for silence, the sentence came loud and clear. Adultery was not only a private hurt, it was treated as a spiritual danger. The church taught that it invited damnation, that it called forth demons, that it twisted the soul into something impure. Sermons spoke of fire, of temptation, of the serpent who waits in soft touches and secret words. The people listened, they nodded, and in their hearts, they feared. But human hearts are not made of rules, and even in a world shaped by control, affection could still slip through the cracks. A wife, neglected and lonely, might find warmth in the voice of another. A husband, tired of routine and silence, might reach for someone who smiled too often. Not all who strayed did so out of cruelty. Some did so out of longing, out of sadness, out of years spent without touch or tenderness. Still, the laws did not ask why. They only asked if. And if the answer was yes, the punishment followed. No confession of love could soften it. No tears could erase it. Even repentance, spoken with trembling lips in a cold chapel, could not undo the scar that came after. Families suffered too. The children of those accused might be mocked in schoolyards or kept from local games. Sisters might lose suitors. Brothers might lose trade. A single moment of desire, once revealed, could reach into every corner of a life. And in small villages, where every name was known, no one forgot. And yet, not every story ended in punishment. Some were never discovered. Some were forgiven. And some were covered by silence so deep, no one dared speak of it. There were glances exchanged behind shutters, letters hidden beneath floorboards, hands touched for just a moment while walking beside the fields. These quiet betrayals, small and trembling, often stayed hidden. But but even they carried guilt. Even they weighed heavily in the night. There were couples who survived betrayal. Not all marriages ended in ruin. Some men forgave their wives, some women forgave their husbands, but the scar remained. Trust, once cracked, never fully healed in that world, not when the eyes of neighbours still watched, not when the priest still paused before offering communion. And so people learned to fear their own hearts, to question every feeling that did not belong, to bury desire beneath duty, beneath prayer, beneath silence. It was safer not to feel too deeply, safer to sleep alone in a house full of people, safer to speak plainly and never wonder if someone's voice made the world feel softer. Still, there were those who risked it all, who believed that one moment of true connection was worth the fall, who loved, not carelessly, but with a kind of quiet defiance. Their stories are harder to find, buried beneath shame and erased from records, but they existed, in sighs, in candle smoke, in the silence after midnight. So tonight, if you have ever known the weight of a secret feeling or carried guilt for something you once wished for, let yourself rest. There were many before you who felt the same, whose hearts wandered, not out of evil, but out of need. Let the past be quiet now. Let the stories fade into sleep, and may your own heart find peace where theirs could not. After all, it could be lost for loving the wrong person inside a marriage. The price for loving someone of the same gender was far worse. In the Middle Ages, such feelings were not misunderstood. They were condemned, not as weakness, not as confusion, but as pure defiance against both nature and God. That was how it was taught. That was how it was feared. It did not take much to draw suspicion. A friendship is too close, a glance too soft. Two men walking together was more than others thought proper. Two women were seen holding each other too long. A whisper in the wrong place. A laugh at the wrong time. No proof was needed, only talk. And once talk began, it grew fast and thick, like smoke before a fire. The accusation came first, then questioning, and then, sometimes, torture, because people believed that such love could only come from darkness, and darkness, they thought, must be drawn out, through pain, through prayer, through cleansing of the flesh. Many were taken to the priest or to the judge, not as criminals, but as souls believed to be infected with evil. They were not always given time to explain. Many were not allowed to speak at all. If the accused denied everything, it did not matter. The denial was expected. It was part of the ritual, a kind of dance before the burning. They would be asked again and again, in cold rooms and stone chambers. Did you feel affection? Did you act upon it? Did you touch? Did you dream? Some said yes, not out of guilt, but out of exhaustion. Others remained silent, and in that silence, guilt was assumed. Those who confessed were not forgiven. They were punished. Those who begged for mercy were not spared, because mercy, they were told, did not belong to the unrepentant, and love, they believed, was not meant for such people. Punishments varied by region, by ruler, by whim, but the worst was fire. Public burning was meant to purge the soul and warn the village. There are records of men tied to stakes, surrounded by bundles of dry wood, while crowds gathered with solemn faces. They were not always angry faces. Often they were simply afraid that if they looked too kindly, someone would look at them in the same way. So they watched, and they said nothing. For women, the records are fewer, but they exist. Some were drowned in rivers, others were buried alive in forests. A few were sent to convents, not for silence, but for punishment. Their heads were shaved, their names were erased, their letters burned. What they felt was not named as love, it was named as perversion, and perversion was to be buried, not spoken. Even death did not end the sentence. Those who died for loving the wrong way were not buried in sacred ground. The church forbade it. Their bodies were left outside the cemetery walls. Some were thrown into pits. Others were buried without ceremony, without name, without prayer. It was said that to pray for them was to sin. So the people walked past, eyes down, words swallowed, and yet, not all hearts agreed. Even in that silence, some felt sorrow. A mother who never spoke of her son again, but placed a candle on the edge of the road each year. A sister who carved initials into the back of a wooden bowl, then hid it beneath her bed. A friend who stood near the fire, not in support, but in mourning. No one dared speak, but some never forgot. There were those who survived, who felt something they were told was wrong, and hid it so deeply it was never found. They married as expected. They bore children. They lived quietly, never touching the one person who made them feel alive. They told no one, and when they died, their names were written beside the rest. But inside, they had carried a secret too heavy for words. Others chose solitude. They became pilgrims or wanderers. They travelled from village to village, never staying long. They learned to smile without meaning it, to speak without saying much. They kept their hearts safe by never opening them again. And the world, never asking, never guessed. And yet, through all of it, love remained, even when forbidden, even when punished. It remained in glances, in poems that never used names, in songs with no clear meaning, in dreams that left no mark. It survived because it had to, because the heart, no matter the law, remembers what it longs for. In quiet places, far from towns, there may have been moments, two hands touching for a second too long, a letter buried beneath stone, a kiss was exchanged in the dark where no one watched. These moments were rare, and they were costly, but they were real. And in being real, they gave meaning to the lives of those who lived half-hidden. Today, it is easy to look back and wonder how such cruelty was allowed. But to the people then, it was not cruelty. It was safety. It was what they were taught, that love had rules, that the body had limits, that salvation required a sacrifice. And so, they followed the rules, even when it hurt others, even when it hurt. But not all stories end in silence. Some names survived, in records, in memories, in the spaces between lines. And now, centuries later, they are remembered, not as sinners, not as criminals, but as people who dared to love in a time that offered no mercy. After fear had silenced the hearts of those who loved the wrong person, or the wrong way, there remained another kind of watchfulness, not from neighbours, not from family, but from the church itself. Its reach was long. Its concern was not only for what people did, but for what they felt. Even the smallest tremble of affection could fall under its gaze. Love, in the eyes of the church, was not evil in itself, but it was powerful, and anything powerful could become dangerous. So it had to be kept in place, spoken only in certain ways, felt only within certain bounds. The church wrote rules for it, preached sermons about it, judged it, measured it, contained it. A glance could be questioned, a letter could be read aloud by a priest, a compliment, spoken too sweetly in the wrong corner of a courtyard, might become a subject of confession. People began to weigh their words, to plan their silences. They learned to hide not only what they did, but what they hoped. Because even the shape of a wish could be seen as sin. Sermons were not always angry. Often they were soft. But that made them more lasting. A quiet voice in a quiet chapel, speaking of Eve, of temptation, of the dangers that grow in unchecked longing. Parishioners sat still. They heard stories of saints who turned away from beauty, of martyrs who resisted the warmth of human touch, of how the devil was said to slip between two people too close in the shadows. And so people learned. They looked away when they felt something stir. They changed the subject when laughter grew too bright. A man might fold his hands behind his back rather than risk brushing against a woman's sleeve. A woman might walk the long path around the field to avoid a boy who once made her smile. The church did not forbid love, but it made people cautious of its weight. In confession, feelings were named like crimes. A young girl might kneel on the cold floor and whisper that she had dreamt of someone. She would be asked how often, what she saw, what she felt. A boy might admit that he looked too long at a face in the crowd. He would be told to fast, to pray, to ask for strength, not because he had touched, but because he had wanted. Wanting itself was a risk. There were manuals written for confessors, long lists of questions, guides for how to uncover the truth. Did you imagine a kiss? Did your heart race? Did you think of someone in the night? People came to believe that even their own thoughts could betray them, and in that belief, they grew afraid of their own hearts. Some priests were kind. They listened with gentleness. They understood that love, even quiet love, was part of being human. But others were stricter. They spoke of punishment after death, of fires that never ended, of angels turning their backs. For the penitent, the fear was real. It shaped them. It stayed with them. Young people, especially, were watched closely. A girl who spoke too often to the same boy. A boy who lingered too long near the well where the girls gathered. Parents would ask questions. Elders would keep count. And if the priest thought a pattern was forming, he might take one aside and speak with firm kindness. "You're not wicked," he might say, "but you're in danger." He would not raise his voice. He would not need to. And because of this, love began to wear a new face. It became something to be confessed, not celebrated. Something to feel guilt over, not joy. A weight to carry in silence, rather than a light to carry together. It still happened. Of course it did. But it bent beneath rules that shaped its form into something harder to name. Even within marriage, the rules were present. A husband who adored his wife too openly might be seen as weak. A wife who longed too much for her husband might be warned to guard her soul. They were told to love moderately, carefully, with purpose. Desire was allowed only at certain times, and even then, it was to be controlled. The line between affection and lust was thin, and the church held that line firmly. There were those who questioned this, quietly. A monk who once loved, long ago, before he took his vows. A widow who remembered a touch that no confession had ever erased. A mother who watched her daughter hide her feelings and wondered if it had to be that way. But questions were dangerous, and silence was safer. Still, love remained. It did not disappear. It folded itself into the shape of a prayer. It hid behind careful glances and respectful greetings. It became something people carried quietly, like a keepsake wrapped in cloth and tucked inside a drawer that was never opened. And through all of it, the church believed it was saving souls. It was guiding people away from chaos, that it was lifting them toward heaven. Maybe it was, or maybe it simply taught them to fear what made them human. Tonight, we look back not to judge, but to understand. The world was different then. The dangers were real, and people did what they thought was right. But in the spaces between sermons and rules, between confessions and prayers, hearts still beat. They still reached for each other. They still remembered what it felt like to hope. So if you have ever hesitated before speaking a feeling aloud, or held back a truth because of fear, know that you are not the first, and you are not alone. Let the past rest beside you now. Let the weight of those quiet hearts fade into the hush of sleep. The night is soft, and it asks nothing from you. Close your eyes, let your breath slow. Sleep well, and sleep warm. The next story waits for you in the silence to come. In many places, even after the church had placed its fingers deep into the folds of the heart, Another force stood quietly behind love and steered it into shapes more useful to the world. That force was power. Marriage, for much of the medieval world, was not about joy or companionship. It was an arrangement, a tool, and at times a burden, especially for those born into noble blood. Among the noble class, love was rarely consulted. Alliances were what mattered. The land needed to be joined. Borders needed to be sealed. Families needed to grow stronger by linking names and fortunes. So marriage became a strategy, a negotiation between fathers, a list of terms, a map drawn in ink and sealed with a wax, long before the bride and groom had even seen each other's faces. The ceremony, when it came, was more form than celebration. The couple stood, often in silence, and nodded when told. They might not speak to each other that day. Sometimes they would not meet again until the wedding feast. The bride might wear a dress chosen by someone else, with jewels that did not belong to her. The groom might already have plans for battle, travel, or court duties. Their lives were set, not by feeling, but by need. In many regions, a child could be promised to another while still in the cradle. These promises were made in letters, through messengers, or before a local lord. If one family had more land and the other had more soldiers, a union made perfect sense. Whether the children liked each other or would ever grow to care was not part of the question. It simply did not matter. There are stories, quiet ones, of brides who wept on their wedding night, not because they feared their husbands, but because they feared the life ahead, a castle not their own, a language they barely spoke, a man who saw them as an extension of an agreement. Their names changed, their clothes changed, their futures, shaped by people who had spoken in rooms they had never entered. For some, marriage was not just about love. It was without consent. In certain lands, a woman might be forced to marry a man much older, or one who had already buried a wife. She might be told that her feelings were childish, that her tears were foolish. Obedience was expected, and disobedience could bring shame to her family. No one wanted to be the daughter who ruined a treaty. Even for men, choice was limited. A younger son might be sent to marry a widow twice his age, simply to gain access to her lands. A prince might be joined with a woman from a distant kingdom to settle a war or strengthen a trade route. Whether he felt affection was beside the point. His duty was to the bloodline. Priests blessed these marriages, not because they were romantic, but because they were lawful. The church approved of unions that brought order, that preserved wealth, that created heirs. It did not ask if the husband would cherish his wife. It asked if the union was pure, and if the children would be legitimate. These were the questions that mattered, and yet not every noble marriage was without warmth. Some couples grew to care for each other. Some found peace in shared goals, in raising children, in learning how to live together. But others remained distant. They slept in separate chambers. They met at meals. They maintained appearances in court and held their silence in private. Their lives were parallel paths, rarely crossing. For the poor, things were different. Love did not always guide them either, but there was sometimes more space to choose. A farmer might marry a neighbour's daughter, not for land, but because she worked hard and smiled kindly. Still, even among peasants, families had opinions. A bad match could bring ruin. A lazy husband, a sickly wife, a marriage without dowry or tools. These things mattered more than whispers of the heart. Dowries were not just noble concerns. Even in small villages, a woman was expected to bring something into the marriage: a cow, a chest of linen, a corner of the field. If she had nothing, her chances of a good match were slim. If a man had no roof, no steady work, no name, he might find himself alone for life. Survival came first. Feelings, if they came at all, were seen as a blessing, not a requirement. In many homes, marriage was the start of quiet labour. Days filled with planting, cooking, mending and raising children. The idea of happiness was tied not to emotion, but to endurance. A good marriage was one that did not fall apart, one where both partners lived long enough to see their children grown. This was the measure of success. But not everyone accepted these rules. Some people ran. Lovers fled together into the woods, hoping to find freedom in another village. A few women refused their arranged marriages, choosing instead to join a convent. Some men lived alone, unable to stomach the life expected of them. Their stories are rare because they were not honoured, but they existed, quiet threads in a heavy cloth, and behind every wedding bell and church blessing, behind every feast and embroidered gown, there was often a quiet question in someone's heart. What might have been, if choice had been allowed? What kind of life could grow from a seed of affection, rather than a ledger of gain, tonight? You do not have to answer those questions. You do not need to weigh your heart against the past. Just let the images drift. Let the halls of stone and whispered bargains fade into shadow. Let the noble bride rest her head without fear. Let the poor man dream of someone who chooses him not for land, but for laughter. Close your eyes. Let the fire crackle. Let your thoughts grow still. And may your sleep come like a gentle promise, kept only for you. The girl sat quietly in the corner of the room, her head lowered, hands folded in her lap. The voices of her parents filled the space, calm but firm. Outside, someone was feeding the chickens. A rooster let out a half-hearted crow, and a dog barked in the distance. But inside, everything was still. The girl was told she would be married. The decision had been made last winter. The agreement was sealed over wine, and now that spring had come, the wedding must follow. She was 16, with hands rough from washing linens and cheeks still soft with youth. She had never spoken to the boy she was to marry. She'd seen him once, across the courtyard, standing with his brothers, not looking her way. To love someone not chosen by your family was not simply difficult, it was unthinkable. A daughter was not meant to choose. A daughter was meant to obey. To question a betrothal was to question the honour of the family. A father who lost control of his daughter would be whispered about in the fields. A mother whose child refused a husband would lower her eyes at the market. If a girl resisted too much, there were ways to silence her. A slap, a locked door, a cold room and a bowl of porridge until she came to her senses. Some were sent to convents. Some never returned. Not all girls cried. Some accepted their role quickly, too frightened to say otherwise. Others cried themselves to sleep every night until the wedding came. Some fainted during the ceremony, but the priest would go on. The crowd would murmur. The deal was already done, and if a girl dared to speak against it, to say no in front of witnesses, she could be struck where she stood. Her refusal was a scandal. The groom's family could demand compensation. The church could punish. A girl could be cursed as disobedient, sinful, or even possessed. There were stories passed between village girls, in whispers over laundry basins or during walks to the well. A girl who threw herself into the river. Another who drank something bitter from the herb woman. One was said to have screamed so loudly before her wedding that the priest fled. No one knew what happened to her after. These were not fairy tales. These were warnings. If your heart wandered, you kept it quiet. If your stomach twisted with dread, you said nothing. If your eyes welled with tears, you blamed the smoke from the fire. There were mothers who looked away, who stroked their daughter's hair and said softly, "It will be better once you're used to it," who handed down their wedding dresses without a word, who had once cried in the same way, in the same small rooms, but had learned how to forget. There were fathers who drank too much the night before the wedding, who avoided their daughter's eyes, who clenched their fists when she hesitated but did not raise them. There was sorrow, but sorrow was expected. What mattered was obedience. What mattered was survival. If a girl did run, it was not far. She had no coin, no horse, no friends outside the village. Her world was fenced by custom, by forest, by fear. Some were dragged back before sunset. Others wandered into the woods and were never seen again. And even if she found shelter elsewhere, word would spread. A runaway bride was marked. No man would take her in marriage. No house would offer her work. No priest would hear her confession without suspicion. She would carry her shame like a shadow. There were no songs for girls who refused arranged marriages. No poems, no praise, only silence. And when they were buried, it was often without a name on the stone, just a cross. If that, the village would move on, the land would be tilled, another wedding would be planned. The daughter of a cousin this time, and she was quiet, she would not resist. The pain of forced marriage was rarely spoken aloud. It lived in the small things. The way a bride stood stiffly beside her husband. The way her mother pressed her lips together during the feast. The way no one mentioned the girl who used to smile more before the match was made. But even in the sadness, life went on. Bread was baked. Goats were milked. Children were born and raised. Some women found peace. Others found small joys. A sleeping child. A warm corner by the fire. The smell of herbs in a summer garden. Still, the idea that a girl could choose her own husband for love was dangerous. It suggested that she had a will of her own, that her heart mattered more than the farm, the land, the dowry. It threatened the balance of things. So it was crushed, quietly and thoroughly, in the church, in the home, in the silence of a wedding night spent with a stranger. Even when a girl died because of it, the village did not speak her name with pity. She should have obeyed, they said. She was stubborn. She brought shame. Her grave was a reminder, not of grief, but of what happened to those who did not listen. Now, as we sit by this quiet hearth, centuries later, it may seem impossible that love could be feared, but it was. Not the quiet affection of a long marriage, not the gentle care of family, but the idea of love as a choice. That was the threat, and so it was punished, again and again, until most forgot there had ever been another way. The fire is low now. The night presses close against the window panes. Let your breath slow. Let the sadness of those old stones soften into sleep. May you rest in peace, and may your dreams be kinder than those old vows. Good night. Somewhere beyond the fields where daughters wept in silence and priests wrote rules against longing, there was another place, a space that felt softer, quieter, though it was no less part of the same world. It was a court, but not like others, not ruled only by law or sword, but by conversation, music, and something more unusual for the time. It was ruled, in many ways, by love. Not the kind whispered in corners or hidden in folded letters, but a love discussed openly, studied, even celebrated. This was the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was not an ordinary woman. Born to power and wealth, she had walked through castles and coronations, crossed mountains, survived wars, and ruled beside kings. She had seen the way marriages were arranged like treaties, the way women were silenced beneath veils and obligation. But unlike others, she did not accept it quietly. She dreamed of something else, and when she had the means, she created it. In her court, poets were not just entertainers. They were invited to speak of feelings, to describe what it meant to long for someone, to ache, to wait. Women sat beside men, not behind them. They debated the meaning of devotion. They asked whether love should be based on desire or kindness or shared purpose. They did not always agree. That was the point. The discussion itself was the freedom. Eleanor encouraged these talks. She listened. She supported writers and thinkers. She created a court where women were not only present but powerful, where their voices mattered, where a young girl might ask questions and not be punished for curiosity, where a widow might speak of a love once lost without being told to forget. There were rules. Still, it was not chaos. But the rules were not written by the church or enforced by shame. They were formed through dialogue, through stories, through trial and error. People in her court tried to understand love, not just control it. They looked for a balance between passion and responsibility. They asked how affection could exist without destroying order. It was a careful line to walk, but they walked it. Many did not understand what Eleanor was doing. To some, it seemed foolish. To others, dangerous. The idea that women could shape the language of love, that they could influence poetry, that they could define honour in romantic terms, it unsettled many. But Eleanor did not stop. And over time, her court became known across Europe. Nobles travelled from distant lands just to see it, to listen, to learn. Young women in other regions began to dream of more, of conversations they might have, of the choices they might make. Songs carried the ideas far beyond Aquitaine. A single lyric, heard in a market square, could change the way a girl saw her own heart. The ripple spread. Of course, not everyone could live as Eleanor did. Her status protected her. Her intelligence sustained her. But her influence reached far, and even those who never visited her court felt its warmth. A letter was passed between friends, a poem copied in the margins of a prayer book, a story shared in secret. These things mattered. For a time, love was not only sorrow and silence, it was also curiosity. It was a topic worthy of salons, not just sermons. It was something that could be taught, refined, and shaped with care. Eleanor's daughters continued her work. They supported writers who explored the emotional world. They hosted their own gatherings, asked their own questions. They too believed that love, when approached with dignity and thought, could be something noble, not just a force to be feared or hidden, but a part of life to be lived fully. The court of love, as it was sometimes called, did not last forever. Time shifted, power moved, other voices grew louder. The old rules reasserted themselves in many places, but the memory of that court lingered. It whispered to those who came after. It reminded them that the heart could be given room to breathe. In that small pocket of history, there was laughter not muffled by fear. There were letters that did not have to be burned. There were glances exchanged without guilt. There was hope. And even if most people lived far from that court, the idea of it gave comfort. It offered a vision of what could be. It told a story different from the ones written in law books or carved in stone. A story in which love was not a weakness, but a strength. Tonight, you do not need to imagine the castles or the gowns. Just picture a room lit with low candlelight. The air was filled with quiet music. A woman speaking softly, and others listening not with judgment, but with care. The scent of rosemary and wine, the sound of thoughtful laughter, and in that room, the knowledge that no feeling would be punished simply for being true. Let that room stay with you as sleep begins to rise. Let it be a place you can return to, any time the world feels too heavy. Let the voice of Eleanor guide you, not with command, but with calm. Breathe slowly. Rest your hands. The past will wait. The next candle has not yet gone out. Sleep gently, and may your dreams be filled with rooms where your heart is welcome. They did not wear crowns. They did not hold swords, but their words carried further than banners on the wind. The poets of the medieval world were not rulers or warriors. They were singers, wanderers, and storytellers. They arrived with nothing but a lute, a voice, and the weight of old verses held close like prayer. In castle halls and village squares, they unravelled stories stitched with longing, and with each line they stirred something ancient and dangerous. Love. Their voices were soft, but what they spoke of was bold. In a time when affection was governed by law and marriage sealed by land, they sang of something that could not be owned. The love in their songs was tender, reckless, and free. Not always wise, not always chaste, but deeply human. They didn't ask permission from the church or the crown. They simply sang. And through their melodies, the idea of romance began to slip beneath the doors of abbeys and manor houses. You might imagine a crowd gathering in a square, just past the noon bell, children pressed to their mothers' skirts, a baker with flour on his hands, and an old man pausing in his sweeping, and there,